Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
Well, welcome everyone to Balkan Circle. My name is Mary Newberger. I'm a professor of history here at UT Austin and also our director, the Center of Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And Kirill is my co-host.
Thank you very much, Mary. My name is Kirill Evermov, and I'm an assistant professor of political science at the same department, and also a proud co-host of Mary at Balkan Circle, a place that brings together all the scholars and connoisseurs of all things Southeast European and Balkan. And today we're, excited to have Ulf as our special guest. And as you can see, even at the first image already is captivating. So Mary, I would like to invite you to present our speaker today, and I hope that this will be a very lively session with a lot of questions and interactions.
Yeah, I have questions already just looking at the image, but okay, well, it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Ulf Brunbauer, who's a major figure in Southeast European studies. He is the academic director currently of the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies in Regensburg. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Graz in Austria. And in 2006, he was awarded a habilitation by the Free University of Berlin. Since 2008, he has held the chair of Southeast and East European history at the University of Regensburg. Dr. Brunbauer's research revolves around the social history and historical anthropology of Southeastern Europe since the 19th century, with a particular focus on migration history, the history of labor, environmental history, and historical family research. He's especially interested in the relationship between social practice and social structures and the dynamics of transformations. His most recent book, which I believe this talk is based on, is in German, but I'll give you the English title, In the Storms of Transformation, Two Shipyards Between Socialism and the EU. And this was with a number of co-authors, including Philipp Ther. He's also recently written, which was also kind of an edited project, the Routledge Handbook of Balkan and Southeast European History with John Lampe. And he's the author of Globalizing Southeastern Europe, Immigrants, America, and the State since the 19th Century, which came out in 2016 and was a single-authored book. But he has, of course, many other publications in English and German. So I'm really looking forward to this talk and learning more about shipbuilding and, intriguingly, the loss of meaning. So take it away.
Thank you, Mary, for this kind introduction, and also Kirill for hosting me. It's really a pleasure to talk to you. Well, I was told that if you speak to an American audience, you need a bold title. So I promised a new history of transformation, although I fear that I'm not going to live up to this promise. So I will talk about shipbuilding. I will talk about transformation, about what that meant to especially workers. On the case of Croatia, Mary already mentioned the book on which I draw that came out a year ago, February 2022, which was written by a collective of authors. So it's really collective monograph, very much in the spirit of sort of our research object, which are also collectives that build ships. It was a group of, we were not very good in gender diversity, but at least when it comes to disciplinary backgrounds and also countries from where we come, we're a pretty diverse group of authors. And the book is going to come out in English with University of Toronto Press later this year. I will talk you through, in a way, one half of our book, which is a comparative study of two shipyards, one in Poland, in Gdynia, and the other one in Pula, in Croatia/Yugoslavia. And this is the case study I'm going to focus on today, because obviously this is the Balkan circle. I mean, in Pula, Istria, Croatia is already pretty much of a borderline case when you talk about the Balkans, at least in Croatia, you would not make yourself very popular to situate your country in Southeastern Europe, and even less so in the Balkans. Anyway, let me start with a very brief sort of table of contents of the purpose of this talk, which is also in a way the purpose of our book. So what we were interested in was the temporality and also the spatiality of transformation. So when did transformation from state socialism or self-managed socialism in Yugoslav case to whatever or however you would call the systems then emerging after the end of communist rule, when did it actually take place? When did it start? When did it end? We were also interested in the interplay of different scales on which transformation actually occurred, from the very local to the global, and how they interacted. We were particularly interested also in the question what has been lost, because this is one of the driving questions in much of the research, especially the social anthropological research, on which we drew heavily on transition, on transformation. And at the end, I want to briefly talk about, that's probably something for the Q&A then, how we can actually assess transformation. You might wonder why we focused on shipbuilding, which in some ways seems an esoteric or even exotic pursuit, but there's at least one very good argument, because 90% of global trade at some point is carried over the waves. So obviously ships are really crucial for global trade. And incidentally, Croatia, Yugoslavia, and also Poland were important shipbuilding nations, or used to be. Let me start with a small story from 1978. In 1978, the then General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, of the People's Republic of China, visited Yugoslavia. And on his trip to Yugoslavia, he was also brought to Pula, this very scenic town in Istria on the Adriatic coast, and he visited the Uljanik ship plant. And according to the reports from them, he was very impressed by this shipyard at a moment when China didn't have any civil shipbuilding to speak of, 1978. Yugoslavia at that time concluded, and also the Uljanik shipyard in Pula concluded agreements and contracts with China. They built some ships for China. They delivered engines, and in a way helped to kickstart shipbuilding of merchant ships in China, which the Chinese communists considered, and up to this day, consider an important industry that could serve as a kind of an incubator for further industrialization. So moving fast forward to 2019, another Chinese delegation visited the Uljanik shipyard in Pula, which at that time was already standing still for roughly a year, because they ran out of money in 2018 and had to stop production. In 2019, there was a meeting, a summit of the so-called 17 or nowadays 16+1 initiative, which is one of these Chinese attempts to facilitate its so-called road and belt initiative, bringing together East European, Southeast European countries plus China, talking about infrastructure investments and so on. And the summit in 2019 took place in Dubrovnik in Croatia, and the Croatian Prime Minister asked his Chinese colleague whether, if the Chinese would be interested in investing into the failed shipyard in Pula. The Chinese are nice people, so they sent over a delegation from one of their major shipbuilding companies, which visited the Uljanik shipyard. You have the picture here. And what we know from the local press is that they believe to be in a museum of shipbuilding, because the technology used in Pula was so antiquated. Nothing came out of it. There was a lot of hopes. You see this one guy holding a welcoming sign to the Chinese, there was a lot of local hope that the Chinese might rescue the Pula shipyard, but they didn't, because with all the also geopolitical ambitions China has with its foreign also economic policies, they also want to earn money, which was obviously not very realistic with this failed China shipyard. And the China story doesn't stop here. So the next Chinese visit was in 2020, when a very specific transport ship built in China, owned by a Chinese state-owned shipping company, was called to come to Pula in the Adriatics to take a ship that the Pula shipyard was not able to finish, piggyback, and bring it to Gdansk, where it was finished. So that's in a way the ironic end of our story, that it took a Chinese-owned, Chinese-built ship that traveled thousands of miles from China to Pula to bring a half-built ship from one European Union shipyard to another. And this story, this Chinese story, gives you, I think, an indication of where we head, at least when it comes to the business aspect of our story. We are really interested in understanding how globalization and the emergence of China and also other Asian tigers impacted the social and economic changes in the late socialist and post-socialist era in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. A few words about my case study. So I will speak about the Uljanik shipyard in Pula, which is probably the only shipyard in the world located next to a Roman amphitheater, Pula in Istria, and it used to be a pretty large shipyard, one of the leading ones in Europe, and also one of the oldest. It was established in 1856 when Pula was the main Austrian military port, and to support the Austrian Navy, a shipyard was created as well, which then later started to build also merchant vessels. It has an interesting story per se. Pula is an interesting place because in many ways it exemplifies all the ruptures of Southeast European history, especially in areas like the Upper Adriatic, where borders changed frequently and where also populations were exchanged frequently. For the Uljanik shipyard, a very momentous event was Pula and Istria to become part of Yugoslavia after World War II, when most of the Italian population left. Pula lost 90% of its population and was resettled by domestic migrants from other parts of Croatia or from other parts of Yugoslavia. And this also gave the shipyard a very specific meaning because it became one of the flagships of Yugoslavia, of socialist industrialization of a region that used to be in the contemporary terms backward, rural, mainly, and then also having this notion of also being an example of the Yugoslavification of an area that belonged to Italy in the interwar period until the end of World War II. The shipyard also became a good example of Yugoslav economic policy making because by the 1950s, the Yugoslav communists decided to transit to an export-oriented or export-led development strategy, supporting industries like shipbuilding with huge state investments to become major exporters in order to earn money which could be used for the further development of Yugoslavia. Uljanik, since the late 1950s, was building ships mainly for foreign customers and not for the domestic shipping lines. It became really a showcase enterprise. So when Khrushchev, for example, visited Yugoslavia, he was also brought to Pula and visited this shipyard. So there was already this high sort of political symbolism and attribution of. This is one of the meanings we talk about. It was in the book, a lot of political meaning, symbolical meaning attributed to this industrial enterprise, which to some way was, at least in certain contexts, more important than the mere economic rationale of building ships. Anyway, it became a pretty successful shipbuilding in terms of the quality and number of ships, not in terms of money being earned. Building ships mainly for foreign customers. And this is in a way the starting point of our story, especially when it comes to the question when actually does transformation start. And we are not the only one making this argument. So we think that in order to understand the dissolution of socialism, especially as an economic but also social system, we need to situate it in global economic, global business cycles. And this is one of the reasons why we decided to look into shipbuilding, because shipbuilding is a very global industry. And Yugoslavia is a perfect case in point, as I will show in a minute. So our argument basically is that the beginning of the end of state socialism can be dated in the mid-1970s in the context of the first oil price shock and its consequences it had, not only direct consequences, but also the more immediate ones, meaning that it triggered a significant change, a substantial change in the way businesses were organized and run in the West, and created or increased, in a way, the gulf that existed in terms of productivity and efficiency between socialist and capitalist industries. For the Yugoslavs, this was a particularly heavily felt shock because they were much less insulated from the global market, from the capitalist division of labor than other socialist countries, because they had promoted integration into the world economy, which was a capitalist economy, obviously, since the late 1950s. For shipbuilders like Uljanik, the oil price shock came at a particularly unfortunate moment, because like so many shipyards in the world, they had invested a lot in expanding their capacity in order to benefit from the boom in demand for large tankers since the late 1960s. And this was also the time when shipping transited towards containers. So there was a huge demand for new ships, tankers and container ships in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And shipyards all across the world invested heavily in expanding their capacity. So also the shipyard in Pula, they also entered the market of building these huge tankers for foreign, mostly Western customers. And they were very actually proud, because it was not they didn't have a large dry dock, so they invented a kind of shipbuilding where the hull was produced in two parts and then welded together. So they contracted a couple of these big tankers, and then the world market, especially for tankers, crashed in 1974. So in 1974, as a result of the years thereafter, as a result of the oil price shock, world trade collapsed, and it took almost 30 years for the demand for new ships to recover. So only in 2000 was the demand of 1974 reached again. So for shipbuilders all around the world, this was really a very bad time, the 1970s and 1980s. And whereas shipbuilders in Poland, for example, were a bit more insulated because they produced more for the domestic market or for the Soviet Union, the Yugoslavs had tried to produce especially for Western countries in order to earn hard currencies. And Yugoslav shipbuilding actually was the most export-oriented shipbuilding in the world. So there were years where 100% of ships, and they had 5 big shipyards, went abroad. And so, but suddenly there were no customers anymore in the 1970s. Western nations began implemented protectionism, supported their own, and provided huge subsidies for their own shipbuilders, which the Yugoslavs never never could match, and the Yugoslavs also didn't find a way to redirect the production of ships towards domestic clients, because for domestic shipping companies it was much cheaper to buy a ship abroad than to buy a ship from a Yugoslav shipmaker. So there were some interesting business models, Yugoslav shipyards selling to the Bermudas or Panama or Liberia, these flags of convenience nations, getting some export subsidies from the state, and then Yugoslav shipping lines renting these Yugoslav-built ships, but through owners in Liberia or Panama, and receiving a tariff subsidy from the government. So not very efficient, although very creative. And the problem for the Yugoslav shipbuilders, also for Uljanik in the 1970s and 80s, was that there was hardly any Western customers anymore, so they couldn't sell ships to hard currency countries, but the main customer at that time became the Soviet Union, which had one great disadvantage: that the Soviets either paid in not convertible rubles or in kind. And the Yugoslavs, also Uljanik, they also produced a lot for other non-aligned countries, also for political reasons. And customers in these clients in these countries also had a habit of not paying, or then trying to pay like in cotton or coffee or with bananas. So they built a lot of ships. They actually expanded capacity, employed more workers, so counter to what happened in Western shipbuilding, but they almost never actually earned a profit. On the contrary, they faced huge liquidity problems, and very often their bank accounts were frozen because they were so indebted. So this was the major problem for the Yugoslavs. And at the same time, and this is also part of our global story, at the same time, 70s, 80s, witnessed in the 1990s, witnessed the emergence of two new shipbuilding nations in the world, South Korea and the People's Republic of China, which would become the most dominant shipbuilding countries where governments provided a lot and continue to provide a lot of support. So what the famous Hungarian economist János Kornai once called the soft budget constraints, which he sort of identified as the major characteristic of socialist economies, is something that China and South Korea also provide for their shipbuilders. So this was a time, the time that we call transformation is also a time when we talk about shipbuilding or global trade, when the center of attention moved from Europe, definitely, and for good, to East Asia. Nowadays, Japan, South Korea, and China build roughly 85% of all merchant vessels in the world. This was a major change and a major challenge to which a small country like Yugoslavia or then Croatia obviously could not live up. But this is also a general European story. Shipbuilding very much disappeared in much of Europe, or it's now concentrated on few special sectors like building cruise ships, and obviously also for navies where shipyards enjoy government protection. In 2018, Uljanik also closed its doors. They ran out of money, although they had full order books, but they faced the continuous problem of basically never earning a profit with the ships they built. Building a ship is a pretty costly endeavor. But this is also part of a larger story of shipyards just disappearing worldwide. There's a huge concentration in the shipbuilding industry. And this is one of the arguments we try to make, that with all its specificities, the transformation, at least of certain businesses in Eastern or Southeastern Europe, is also part of a larger transformation of the industrial landscape in the world. And I think Croatia is a very good example of that. Going down a step, or going to a different scale, which is the firm or the enterprise. So another argument that we make is that transformation was not only something that happened, but that was made by also small scale actors. So we use well, at least in German, it doesn't sound totally stupid, the word self-transformation. But this was a transformation very often without clear goalposts, but more kind of muddling through. And this is something we show on the example of how the shipyard, or in our case, the two shipyards that we compared, actually constantly transformed. So transformation in a way was a permanent practice, very often with unintended consequences, which then produced the next transformation in a larger political and economic context of insecurity, which made it really very difficult to conduct any kind of consistent forward planning, because the political context, the ideological context, even the legal context changed so frequently. And again, Yugoslavia is in a way an emblematic case. You all probably know about the complexities of Yugoslav self-managed socialism, and one of its specificities was that in 1976, enterprises were basically disbanded with the introduction of a law called the Law on Associated Labor, which dissolved enterprises and also all kinds of administrations into so-called basic organizations of labor, which at least nominally or on the paper of the law were independent from each other. And in the Yugoslav legislation from that time on, also in the constitution, even the word enterprise, poduzeće, doesn't exist anymore. It wasn't just a legal category anymore. This was this radical decentralization that happened as a result of the Constitution of 1974, which made it a bit difficult then, of course, to meet a challenge coming from the global market. If an enterprise is actually not an enterprise anymore, but consists of several, in the case of Uljanik, 12 decentralized autonomous units which should coordinate, but in a way that you would still be competitive on the global market, which obviously this was a catch-22 situation. And one of the reasons also why even export-oriented businesses in Yugoslavia very often hardly made any profits, because the internal institutional setting was not able to mitigate pressures coming from the international market. So in Yugoslavia, since 1976, things were turned upside down. The lowest level of economic organization was actually the most important one, and director of an enterprise was not much more than a coordinator or a spokesperson, but not really a CEO, which created some really weird and unwieldy organizational matrices. What we do show in our example is that because of this very complex situation, the personality of managers became really very important. And the success of enterprises, which legally were not even defined anymore as an enterprise, very much dependent on the social capital, also on the legitimacy towards the workers, but also on the charisma in a way of managers. In our case, there was a very famous manager, a legendary figure, who was head of Uljanik for like 30 years and who managed to sort of still organize something akin to an enterprise out of this mess of self-managed basic organizations of labor. But in a way, Yugoslavia decided to radically decentralize its economic and also any kind of administrative structure at a time when the country actually was under huge pressure to implement reforms in order to change its business practices in a way so that the challenges coming from the international market, coming from also the global crisis, could be met. So Yugoslavia was in a particularly bad or poor position to actually do what was necessary, which is to restructure in a time of increasing oil prices. This muddling through strategies in a way helped or saved the enterprise, the shipyard, even though they faced these illiquidity problems. But at the end, the government always came to help. And also the Yugoslav government system was one of soft budget constraints. But then ultimately, when communist rule came to an end, at least new ideological paradigms were also emerging, which were to orient business practices. So privatization now became the catchword of the day. Efficiency, of course, productivity, earning profits. So what the shipyard did in order to sort of meet these challenges was to invite Price Waterhouse in 1990 to produce a thorough analysis of its potential. And Price Waterhouse produced a very extensive report with this nice SWOT list of strengths and weaknesses. The Jakestarane, the strengths, and Slabos, the weaknesses. And as you can see, there's a long list of weaknesses and not very many Jakestarane strengths. So actually, they identified only two advantages of Uljanik. One was that it had very strong informal relations, which is kind of interesting. So informality not necessarily being bad for running a capitalist business. And they also enjoyed the support of the government. So these were the strengths, and then the long list of weaknesses, which reads like a typical sort of a description of a typical socialist business. So obviously the enterprise had to be transformed. Interestingly, and this is again a specificity of Yugoslavia, privatization first demanded nationalization, because in self-managed socialism there were no real owners. So that basically you could not privatize ownership, because ownership was not in the hand of any clearly identified owner. So first, self-management had to be dissolved, and self-managed enterprises had to become nationalized in order then to the state be able to sell off the assets. So this was step one, in a way counterintuitively, that the first step of privatization in Croatia and other post-Yugoslav republics was nationalization. Privatization, of course, was sort of the dogma also in Croatia in the 1990s, but very often not then carried out for various reasons. Also in our case, but still the business changed. So Uljanik was privatized only in 2012 because of pressure from the European Union. But things changed a lot, and this is what we also think of transformation. For example, one of the more curious, but especially for the historian, more problematic changes is that even though the shipyard didn't become a sort of showcase capitalist enterprise, on the contrary, a lot of socialist practices survived, but it turned into kind of a black box, and I think that's also a pretty important characteristic of capitalism, that we don't actually really know what's going on in enterprises. Whereas a socialist enterprise was really a public one, not only in terms of ownership, but also in terms of visibility of what was going on. And the good example of that is that during socialism, Uljanik produced like 200 pages strong monthly magazine, obviously heavily edited and redacted, but still a wonderful source to understand what was going on, and also what workers, again, of course, selected, redacted and so on, but still kind of a good mirror, a good lens into what was really happening. And after 1990, you have like a five pages bulletin which gives you some information, but only the information that the management wanted to relay to the public. So that's one of the changes you can observe. From the business point of view, 1990 is obviously a very difficult period. Croatia had other concerns initially than to reform its industry. It had to fight and win a war. And then the way Croatia built capitalism, and this was to an extent also a result of the war, was a very peculiar one. So privatization mainly served to basically transfer ownership into the hands of businessmen or business interests closely aligned with the then ruling party, the Croatian Democratic Union, which still rules, and especially the president Franjo Tuđman. So it was basically his cronies that got most of the shares. But for the shipyards, they couldn't find anyone because that needs a lot of investment with a very, very insecure sort of perspective. Croatia spent a lot of money then in order to rescue and then also restructure its shipbuilding industry. So we are talking about billions of euros, really a lot of money for a rather small country and small economy. Privatization also happened at the end because the European Union demanded privatization of shipbuilding as one of the conditions Croatia had to meet in order to be allowed into the club. But there was so much opposition against any large investor from abroad. The trade unions were against, also public opinion, because shipbuilding is considered like a strategic industry where you wouldn't want to sell out to foreign investors. Privatization happened in a way of mass privatization, which is that the workers and also pensioners from Uljanik became the majority shareholders in 2012. So in an ironic twist of history, now workers really became the owners of the shipyard, which was, of course, nice, but which from a business point of view was probably not such a great idea, because obviously these people didn't have any capital to invest. But formally, at least technically, it was now private, and the European Union was happy. What we stress is that these complex privatizations, where you often cannot really say that even if technically private, it is private also in the sort of more narrow sense of the word, because very often these private investors or owners were also part of the state machinery or closely attached to the state. It was also very difficult to draw a clear border between the enterprise and the outside world. This was a very, very, very flexible boundary, basically very permeable. But there's one constant, and this is one of the arguments that we make, that even though many Croatian governments were notionally committed to neoliberal ideas, the state remained a very important economic actor in shipbuilding, but also in other industries, providing a lot of support, direct support, financial support, but also indirect one, facilitating, for example, exports, so foreign diplomacy, also acting as a trade trade representatives of the shipyards. Each and every prime minister had to regularly visit the shipyard, because the public just expected the government to come to help, because this was considered to be a flagship industrial sector that was said to provide a livelihood to many people. And one of the reasons why the government supported shipbuilding to such a high degree was that until its demise, it was the most important export sector in the Croatian economy, which might not say much, because the Croatian economy is not great in exports, it's better in importing things. In 2018, these arrangements came to an end. The shipyard closed 2017, the business year 2017, with a huge loss, and then ran out of money. When you need a lot of foreign capital or loans in order to be able to build ships, because buyers usually pay like 80% only after delivery and only very small upfront payments. So you need to either generate a lot of cash flow, or you have banks that are ready to bankroll the construction. This came to an end. Production stopped. There were some protests in Pula and also Zagreb, where workers demanded the government to step in again, like it did for 40 years. But and also the public opinion was rather sympathetic to their concerns to some degree. But what neither the workers nor the managers nor the Croatian government had really thought through was the consequences of becoming member of the European Union. And so our argument basically is that post-socialist transformation comes to an end when countries join the access to the European Union, because the European Union comes with a totally different regulatory framework, which radically changed the relationship between business and government. Shipbuilding has been a priority of European competition policy since the 1970s, with the European Commission trying to facilitate a restructuring and a consolidation of shipbuilding. And they approved a little bit of support, but not much. So basically now the Croatian government just could not go on with its standard practice of mobilizing taxpayer money in order to rescue the shipyard. Yeah, so soft budget constraints, that's not possible under the EU competition rules. And the government also had the chance to point then to Brussels to be responsible for the ultimate bankruptcy of the shipyard, because they were not allowed to come up again with hundreds of millions of subsidies. And this is a story that the same story happened in our second case study. And interestingly, in both cases, the shipyard survived only 5 years of EU membership, and both bankrupted, and there are more examples because of this very stringent competition rules coming out of Brussels, which make it very difficult for governments to come to help to struggling enterprises, and especially countries in the periphery of the European Union. Obviously, Germany would enjoy more leeway. So at the end, what is lost? I mean, this is a question which much of the transition literature, especially from social anthropology, which I think is pretty much the richest literature on transition, is obsessed. So when there was in Pula, there was this very, very pervasive sentiment or trope, you could even say, that well, like you see it here on this newspaper article, the shipyard fed the whole city. So the clear idea that without the shipyard, the city just couldn't be. Pula is a place with 50,000 plus inhabitants, and by the late 1980s, for example, the shipyard employed almost 9,000 people, plus a couple of thousand so-called cooperanti subcontractors. So it was really providing a lot of jobs. It was the single most important employer. And it was one of the constant also legitimization rhetorics of the management, always to link the fate of the shipyard with the fate of the city, of the region, and of the country, making also then in the 1990s very patriotic, or could say nationalistic arguments. And why did this resonate? Obviously, not only because, and this is of course also a very socialist story, or not only socialist, it's a very Fordist story, you could say, but Fordism which came to an end because of the oil price shock, but not in the socialist world. So it was not only about jobs, but it was this very close strong embeddedness of the enterprise into the urban fabric, providing apartments. So Uljanik owned more than 2,700 apartments in a city of 50,000 inhabitants, social and cultural infrastructure, sports and recreational facilities. It paid almost half of the tax income of the city of Pula came from the shipyard. Workers paid in all kinds of so-called self-managed or self-managed interest communities, which they were responsible from like building streets to running schools and firefighters. So they provided pretty much a good part of the sort of physical but also social infrastructure of the and material infrastructure of the city. And this then begins to be dissolved in the 1990s. And this is where, of course, this pervasive sentiment of loss also comes from, because just in terms of income, average incomes today are much higher in Pula than they used to be in the 1980s, and especially in the 1980s, it was such a difficult period for Yugoslavia. Super high inflation, high unemployment, real wage decline, but still people feel or articulate, all kinds of people, regardless of their political identification, articulate this strong sense of loss. And one of our arguments is that this sense of loss is predicated on the dissolution of the social infrastructure that was linked to the workplace. A social infrastructure that was also sort of physically very present. We produced this map of apartment buildings in and some neighborhoods really full of workers. Was a really shipbuilding environment, but and it transgressed the borders of it transgressed the enterprise. So it really also structured everyday life. The boundaries between everyday life, private life, and the enterprise were very, very flexible or in a way shaded. And this was lost. And what was also lost was this sense of pride in labor. I mean, shipbuilding is a very artisanal kind of job, so it cannot be very automatized. So it is in a way specific. But in the interviews we did, we really could infer that workers, skilled, unskilled ones, engineers, they felt a really high identification with the product of their work, which is a ship. And ships are Christian. So there's a lot of symbolic value to this kind of work. And then in the 90s and especially 2000, this sort of holistic understanding of work really changed. Work became just a job where you earn money, but where the symbolic dimension from which people really drew a lot of pride and also self sort of consciousness gradually disappeared. What has been left? And I'm almost finished. Shipbuilding is gone for good in Pula. Very likely. I mean, it's too small anyway to be competitive. The machinery was outdated already 20 years ago. Nobody's really willing to invest, and Croatia has decided to build on tourism. And all of you who have been to Istria will also understand why tourism is a very viable sector in this place of the world. So the only thing remaining of the shipyard, it still stands idle, and it will stand. It's also something that you can expect in a place like Croatia, that it will take years anyone to dismantle or whatever these machines and halls, so they will slowly just disintegrate. What remains are the so-called lightning giants. A Pula artist and owner of a lighting firm created this. So you have these huge cranes being illuminated very beautifully during the night. They don't move anymore, so it's in a way now bittersweet, because it reminds people of the existence of the shipyard, but at the same time also reminds people that the shipyard doesn't work anymore. During the COVID pandemic, it became just a place where some specialized ships, some of them actually built in Pula, waited for being employed again. Nowadays, the talk is that the Bay of Pula will be transformed into a luxus, a marina for luxus yachts, or probably now, I don't know whether there are anymore enough luxus yachts after Russian oligarchs cannot move so freely anymore in the Adriatic. But anyway, so tourism will, so the build really this vision of the future is built on tourism. And what we could gather from the interviews we made is, although tourism provides, in terms of income, perfect living, and people have also, thanks to these former company apartments which they could purchase very cheaply in the 1990s. Everyone has something to rent out, and thanks to Airbnb, it is also not very complicated anymore. But what you see is that people employed in the tourism industry, they just don't associate it with a lot of sense. So there's really a definite loss of meaning, loss of sense in the world of work and labor. And I think this is something that is driving to some degree also the dissatisfaction that people feel with the results of transformation. Not so much because they experience a decline in living standards, but they experience this kind of loss of meaning, loss of sociability that was predicated on the workplace. Where does this lead us? I mean, if you, I think there are two major works recent works that try to give like an overall assessment of transformation, to which we also relate a bit. One is Christine Gotzi's and Mitchell Orenstein's rather pessimistic account of transformation, taking stock of shock, where they produce a ton of data from different sources and different domains, showcasing that at the end, of course, they differentiate according to countries, but at the end, I think losses weighed more than wins, also because inequality increased so dramatically during transformation. And then there's also a very insightful book by Fritz Bartel, who basically makes the argument that socialist countries or economies failed because socialist or communist governments lacked the legitimacy to pursue policies of austerity. And austerity was, of course, the capitalist answer to the shock of the oil price crisis. And communist governments, for various reasons, could not dare pursue this kind of policies, also because of ideological commitment, and then sort of postponed necessary reforms for so long that then when these reforms were taken, their consequences were even more disruptive than in the West. So I think this is a literature to which we also make a bit of, maybe we provide some nuance, because we draw on two older books, which we find still very helpful to understand this kind of large-scale structural change, which ultimately transformation was, which is on the one hand Karl Polanyi, who is a good teacher to think in terms of a little bit of dialectics, that one movement will produce a counter movement. But what he says, and this is an argument that is very important for us to understand why there is this pervasive sense of loss. When he basically, to cut his very complex story short, he said that modern capitalism is about the disembedding of the economy from other domains of social life. And I think this is exactly where the loss comes from, because in socialism, the economy was embedded, and it becomes disembedded. And this is exactly what people really don't like. Another Austrian on which we draw is Schumpeter. Still valuable to read, because still I think his idea of creative destruction is also a useful antidote to some more sort of nostalgic or very pessimistic assessments of transformation. So one of the arguments that I often make when I'm challenged why we don't portray the end of shipbuilding in a more negative way is that, look, I mean, Croatian taxpayers spent billions of euros to maintain loss-making enterprises, but they didn't spend so much money in supporting, for example, struggling farmers or female workers in textile factories that disappeared in the 1990s, but that lacked this sort of symbolic and political leverage that heavy industry, very male industries, had. And then from the point of view of overall efficiency, probably some things have also to disappear to make room for new things. So now I'm really at the end. Thanks for your attention, and I'm sorry that I think I extemperated a bit.
Thank you very much.
No,
This
the
was excellent.
extemporating was great. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. This was really rich, and I have a lot of questions, but maybe I'll just start with one, and then I can maybe get to some of my other ones later. So I guess one of my questions is about Yugoslav exceptionalism. I mean, a lot of times when I'm at conferences, my colleagues working on Yugoslavia will say, Yugoslavia was so exceptional in X, Y, and Z ways. And I'm often the one to go, well, no, actually in Bulgaria, they did that too. And so I'm wondering, and which isn't true of everything, of course, but because I believe Yugoslavia was exceptional, but maybe in not all the ways people say. So I think the fact that you did the comparative work with Poland might have helped you see in which ways Yugoslavia was exceptional. I mean, talking about the socialist period only, and maybe less so the post-socialist, which again, it's already, I mean, in that period as well, it's going to be different, but like focusing on the socialist period, I guess comparing those two cases, how did it kind of help you understand what was exceptional and what was not in terms of Yugoslav enterprises, even though they didn't even use the word?
No, yeah,
after the
thanks for
70s.
this. That's a great question, because I basically agree with you that this pervasive assumption that Yugoslavia was so exceptional, and very often it comes with a more sort of positive undertone, really needs to be challenged. And they very often tease my friends in the former Yugoslavia by telling them, well, that Mary, I mean, you also notice when you study Bulgaria, it also appears to be pretty exceptional in many things. So obviously when we're speaking about different scales of comparison, and depending on where you look, you will find more similarities or more differences. I mean, I think the one thing when it comes to business history in a more narrow sense, I think Yugoslavia was exceptional for two reasons. One was its stronger integration into world markets, which was the result not of their own choices, but because, as we know, the Soviets kicked them out of their own fold. But it had substantial consequences for Yugoslavia. I mean, but again, we're talking about different sort of scales, because there are other countries like Hungary, also Poland for some time, that were also pretty much trading with the West, but Yugoslavia more, and you had different kind of entanglements. Think of the Gastarbeiter migration, for example, which was really unique. So this made Yugoslavia much more exposed to what was going on in the global economy and less insulated. At least, I mean, also the other socialists were not insulated, but these external forces or external shocks were maybe the impact was felt later, and there was more institutional mitigation, not so in the Yugoslav case. So this is certainly exceptional, and also self-management made really a big difference. Not because I don't think that self-management led to any form of workers' democracy, certainly not. But what it did, it really kept the party pretty much out of business decisions. So self-management helped to localize decision-making, which also meant that in Yugoslavia, in successful enterprises, they always depended on an alliance between workers and the management. trying actually to keep the state out in decision making, not to keep the state out as someone who would bail out the enterprise. So this was not very specific. Yugoslavia also operated on a system of soft budget constraints, but the party was not involved in micromanaging. And you also didn't have the system with a specialized industry, ministries, which provided this chain of command from top to down. Yugoslavia also didn't really have a 5-year plan, or it had a different different purpose. So I think self-management really made a huge difference. And in that regard, Yugoslavia was exceptional. It also helped to, for example, what is one of the things that we compared. In Poland, shipbuilding workers became very much the avant-garde of the proletariat when fighting against communist rule. Not so much in Yugoslavia, because this self-management helped not only to localize decision-making, but also to localize protest. Yugoslavia had thousands of strikes, which were also allowed. But because of self-management, it was really very difficult to actually transcend then the enterprise level and to generate this kind of nationwide working class solidarities. So in a way, self-management actually helped the Yugoslav communists to dissolve protest because it remained localized. So there is some exceptionalism, but of course there's also Polish exceptionalism, and then at the end everyone is exceptional, and which then doesn't tell us anything.
Well, that's
Thank
nice
you.
of you to say everyone's exceptional. I like that.
That is very nice. Mary, if you allow me, before
Yes,
we pass
absolutely.
the floor, well, Ulf, fantastic. It's such a rich talk and sort of a panopticon of political transformation, theory, history, and fantastic case studies. I think that this would be one of the videos that for sure I will be recommending to students to take a look, because we do have our YouTube channel, and a lot of people actually assign videos, to on particular topics from experts such as yourself. There are two themes, which caught my attention during your presentation, which I will make comment and then ask a question. First of all, the two themes actually, when you were quote unquote pride in labor, and I equate this loss of meaning as to loss of identity. In essence, the pictures that you were showing me very much kind of reminded things that I've seen in my childhood in Bulgaria, which means that the industrial giant used to have not only the clubs, the school, but also a sports team. People were very proud to be associated with it, and those pictures that you showed us on people socializing on table and being part of a collective, quote unquote. So this loss of identity is a trigger mechanism in my mind, for either nostalgia or other political kind of opinions about actually current times. Specifically, I was very impressed by the picture of how the prime ministers, are all visiting this place, which is long gone, definitely, in economic terms of viability. But they are all clinging to this social political capital, which allows them to, address multiple other issues. So they use the case as a vehicle in essence. So how do you think, this loss of identity, could be projected, in current politics is my first question. And the other one, as you were describing this, and of course, I was thinking on one end, this is a story of Kremikovci, going down and being particular. And, I have some idea, especially about the transformation of Kremikovci and the political battles in and around, and, the search for investors, such as metal and so on, and nothing came out of it, and it just became very, very at the end, very much, repeated the story basically of what you have shown us. That is, tourists and all kinds of other industries are trying to, not so much tourism, but, they were interested in former properties and lands in and around, which were associated with the enterprise and actually, absolutely other type of business, which was seen by the locals as kind of unproductive and, almost even sometimes obscene. My question, however, is the other, when you were doing the comparative analysis, my question, like immediately, in my mind was like, oh, okay, well, Varna, which has, used to be, connected to the same type of shipping business, did it, or does the trend that, affected this particular shipyard and the one in, like as in comparison with Poland, did it affect, other shipyards as well in the vicinity? Immediately I was thinking, I am aware of also, the political battles of the privatization, of the infrastructure and the ports, Varna, Burgas, and so on. Did they follow suit? Because if that's the thing, that it's a, general trend, which more or less is affecting those businesses. And I know it's a lot, but I'm so excited, about those things, because they kind of speak to, to experience, I suppose.
No, thanks, Kirill. Great question. So let me start with the first one, which is really very difficult. But when you put it much better than I did. The loss is that of
Ulf, if I may,
yeah, you're kind of breaking up.
I mean, this is something we really need to take very seriously.
You were breaking up there for a few minutes. Okay, I think he might be frozen now.
Am I back?
Well, actually, now your video's frozen, but we can hear you clearly now.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yes, we do. Yes.
Yes, so you can continue. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I put out my video because sometimes it helps. Just the bandwidth. Okay. No.
Oh, there he is.
I don't know what happened.
Yeah, bad connection probably. Sorry, could you please repeat? Because it was very interesting, but it started breaking and we couldn't hear. Please.
Yeah, probably. No, certainly the Russians. Everything we blame on the Russians. So,
yeah, maybe just keep the video muted.
I don't know whether you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you really well. Just keep the video
so you
muted.
Need to give me a sign whether you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay. So the loss of the collective, loss of the sense of collective. I think that's really crucial. What Kirill said. This is basically what I mean with this loss that is so pervasively felt. A collective that was built through labor. I think you are losing me again. But the political consequences. I mean, of course, we have this narrative of the transformational losses leading to right-wing populism. But if you look at specific places, you lost me again. I don't know what happened.
I think you've just been a little bit in and out.
Internet connection is actually good.
Okay, now you sound fine. So maybe try one more time.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say, to make the connection between transformational losses, or the losers, so-called losers of transformation, and voting preferences can be very tricky. Obviously, there's this more general narrative of a right-wing populism being fed by the sentiments of loss. But if you look at specific places like also Pula or Gdynia in Poland, then you do see that these places vote left wing or liberal in the case of to draw a very easy connection between these two things. They can translate into very different political preferences, and the Croatia political cleavages are running. They are more regional than social to a certain degree. And Istria is still a place very proud of its, or like at least saying so, of its multi-ethnic feeling, this distance towards Zagreb. So they think are very, very ambiguous. Written a little bit on Trebikovci, but I don't know anything about the Varna shipyard. But in general, when this is a larger European story, it's a story which is part of this large scale sort of relocation of shipbuilding away from Europe. I mean, UK being the most extreme example, which was the leading shipbuilding nation in the 1950s, in the 1980s, basically going down to zero. So if you know Sting's musical, The Last Ship, you can actually hear nice songs about it. And then it was even more facilitated, this process, by the European Union rules as they were implemented then gradually in one accession country after the other. But I don't know specifically about Varna or Burgas, but I do a little bit know about Romania, where it's a very similar story, and also most Polish shipyards going down because they depended on had depended on soft budget constraints, never really managed to become super efficient. And once these policies of soft budget constraints became unviable because of European Union rules, these industries were gone. Now there's a certain rehabilitation of industrial policy going on in the EU. I don't know whether you follow this discussion. So now, when they see this dependency on China, and then also in response to what's going on in the US, but for the shipyards, it comes too late.
Okay, my dog's barking in the background, but
thank you very much, Ulf. And I know how hard it must be, like for in and out. This is why in the chat I put some, links, like common knowledge and so on. But I believe it's my feeling that it might be the similar kind of pattern, and the reason being, not only with, I would argue, not only with this industry, with others, which are capital intensive and, also, produce rather unique products, is that in the beginning they were seen as political prizes, in the initial stages of state capture. So immediately the first thing was like to break it, like mass or cash privatization. And in essence, what really, we have observed, at least in Bulgaria, but I would argue, like in other countries in the region as well, is that the new owners, started decapitalizing in essence, immediately, because there was kind of the sensible, I suppose, sensible strategy, which meant sell the machines, capital investment, was not performed. I believe that all of the countries, like post-transitional countries, suffered, at certain point, and probably continue to suffer. Of another big question which came to my mind when you were talking about is the post-privatization control, a big political problem in parliament, because you don't, supposedly on paper we have the mechanism, right, of supervising after the ownership was transferred. However, in practice, because of the, sort of the schemes and corruption which were involved in this privatization process, resulted in I would argue, catastrophic results for anyhow unviable but depopulation. For instance, in Bulgaria, I can think of a very specific example, like in the city of Dimitrovgrad, which was built around a chemical, sort of a complex and so on. And at the end, it resulted in net migration and depopulation because of loss of jobs. The whole, literally the whole city was organized around those industries. And I
right.
would argue that Yugoslavia, has other examples, like that. I mean, that collapses, mine business, be it or so on. Shipping is very peculiar though, because it requires special machinery and skills and so on.
It does.
Sorry, I got excited.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, what you really see is that we need to look into governance problems. The weakness of the is a major issue. Even there where the state was still owner, they very often actually didn't know what to do with their property. And I think there's a certain reason why countries with still better functioning states like Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland were more successful in transforming the industries, and geography played a role. I mean, the closer you are to Germany.
Do we have any other questions? Lad?
Hello, thank you. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I also wanted to go back to this idea of disembedding the economy from other forms of social life, which I thought was really fascinating, and in this discussion of loss as well. And so the first part of my question is, do you think that this is the case? Is this part of the Fordist paradigm? So was even in the capitalist West, do you think industrial labor is just more embedded in social life? And let's say, post-Fordist labor, I know that's kind of a big question. And then also, the second part of that question is, what do you think sort of steps in to fill that loss? I mean, obviously the loss is felt. We could see that from your, presentation from the shipyard. But is it just kind of better living sort of just the income? In the case of Pula, people can profit from the tourist sector and can, repurpose these apartments, rent them out. And is it, is this kind of a feeling of social atomization, or is there something in, is the, what kind of comes to supplant it, or if anything?
No, man, that these are two great, really great questions. So I do think, of course, this like large scale process of disembedding the economy and severing the ties between social life and the economy, which is of course, but it's an ideal, typical notion. That's already characteristic for modern capitalism as it developed in the 19th century. So that would be Polanyi's argument. But I would agree with you that when it comes to classical Fordist industries, which of course were only a part of the economy, but the factory life organization was really very similar to socialist economies, at least up to the 1960s or early 1970s. So in terms also of the welfare that was provided by entrepreneurs, job security, housing, and even sort of promoting also a certain ethos, a certain morale. So I think I would rather see more, at least when we speak about big industries, more similarities between East and West going into the 1960s, but then in the 1970s with this completely revolutionization of business principles and shop floor organization in the West, it really there's a huge divergence. But generally, I do think maybe we don't know anymore. Those of us who were raised, who lived all their life in a capitalist society, probably don't feel this urge so much anymore. But generally, I do think that people, most of the time in human history, actually want to have a kind of holistic life worlds, where what they are doing in order to survive also has a meaning beyond just get to get their belly full. So I think there's I think that's maybe a human constant to search for an embedded embedded life, which capitalism was very successfully to severe this embeddedness, or to dissolve, and still make us happy, or at least make us believe that we are happy. And I think the missing variable here is, and this is what will happen in, or is already happening in post-transition countries, is consumerism. But it takes some time for this also new value system to really take hold. The people we could interview now, they all have vivid memories of a different time. So I don't want to make any value judgment which one is better, but I think what we have been observing, those studying transformation, is this very difficult change from an embedded economy into a consumerist one. I mean, even though also under socialism there was kind of consumerism, but it was still a very different kind of consumerism with more limitations, and also in a way more embedded in other concerns. But we also basically see, at least in our small case study, it's actually, I mean, there's a certain degree of nostalgia, but people are not necessarily pessimistic. They articulate a sense of loss, but not in the way that they would say, okay, there's no future, but they're also articulating visions of the future which are still based for the time being on bonds and practices of sociability that were practiced during socialism and early post-socialism. So I think these things are still there, and maybe they continue to be there. Difficult to say, but people try to make something out of their lives, even if things change, and they are very resilient, I think. But it will be a very different kind of society once this process of transformation has come to an end.
Thank you.
All right. Are there any more questions? Okay. Hello, Damir.
Yeah, I have some questions about the talk, but I hope that I will have also a chance to talk with you in person soon. Now I would like to ask the question about the future projects, because I understood that that was a publication a year ago, but I know that it's part of this bigger project about deindustrialization, reindustrialization, that you will have a wonderful conference in Vienna in I think early June. So maybe you can tell us a little bit that what are the next steps.
Well, the next step is indeed we don't know yet exactly where we are going, Philipp Ther and me, but we at least try, and this is what this conference that we organize in Vienna in June. We try to globalize our story more, to really integrate comparisons with case studies, maybe in shipbuilding, but not necessarily in shipbuilding, from other parts of the world, especially East Asia. So now it has become obvious that China, not only China, is salient to this story, but we don't know much about how salient the Eastern European or European story is to China, and what really the concrete entanglements are. So this is what we plan to do. We also want a bit to challenge this pervasive narrative of deindustrialization, which I think is just plainly false when it comes to Eastern Europe, which obviously industries disappeared, but many other industries appeared. And levels of industrial employment, for example, share of industry in GDP are much higher in many post-socialist countries than in Western Europe. In Croatia, more people, percentage-wise, are employed in manufacturing than in Germany, for example, which hardly any Croat would believe. But and this is what the numbers say. But we see there's a total disconnect also in the ways how things are perceived and how you can measure them. So we want to ask, what are the contextual conditions that lead to deindustrialization in some cases, to industrialization in other cases. So that's the idea of the conference in Vienna, and if it works out, then we probably are going for an ESC grant or something similar.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this wonderful talk and for continuing to
Thank you.
help us understand this region in global context, which you're doing such great work along those lines and contributing to such a great, I think, direction in the scholarship. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes.
And sorry for the connection problems. You see, Germany, everything is going down.
It's not your fault. It's okay.
Thank you very much. We do appreciate it. Let's remind everyone that we're looking forward to have you on our next Balkan Circle, which will happen in a week of time. So keep safe. And thank you very much once again for being part of our circle.
Or Kirill, I think it's 2 weeks, isn't it? Aren't we?
Yeah, because
2
we're...
weeks. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for coming.